Good morning. I'm Alica. I'm the Executive Director at Nia Centre for the Arts. And I thought, when talking about precarity, which of course is kind of a tough topic for today on Thursday, but I thought I would use some genesis of, I think, this organization has had to go through a lot of precarity in its origin and its development. It's preceded by a lot of precarity. I think Black artistic production is just brought in an environment that's fraught with precarity. So I still think there are some gems and resilience and learnings within our story and what brought us here today. So the building that you're in has a long history, but for us, we've been in this building for the past 10 years. And the idea of the center actually stems back to 2008. So the Nia Centre was born out of the Youth Challenge Fund, which was a fund that was set up after the Summer of the Gun in 2006, which was a summer in which over 60 young Black men lost their lives in Toronto due to gun violence. And for probably the first time, the province, at the time, the provincial government, decided to make a major investment in particularly supporting Black youth. And sort of naming the funding as being designated for them and being designated to Black youth in Toronto's inner suburbs, which is where a lot of the violence was happening. And so the fund was a partnership between United Way and the province, and sort of a group of community leaders were brought together to figure out how to distribute the funding. And so there was a number of rounds of investments in particularly youth-led initiatives, and there was quite a uproar in the sector at the time because youth-led wasn't really to have the strong roots of it as now and understanding. But towards the end of the existence of the fund, because it was meant to be temporary, they began to think about legacy projects. So projects that would live beyond the life of the fund and hopefully have a long-term existence in the city and be an ongoing resource. And one of the areas that was recognized as an important vehicle for young people was the arts. And that, so many young Black creatives were talented and creative and putting out work, but didn't really have an ongoing resource to support them in honing those skill sets and those talents. And so a group of artists are brought together, folks like Debbie Young, who's an amazing playwright, Amanda Paris, a playwright and writer, and I know her from her work on CDC, William Gesha, who's now the artistic director at Soul Pepper, Ian Canal, a musician and writer himself, Dr. Mark Campbell, who's an archivist and hip-hop professor in Scarborough, Dr. Phil Cooper, an academic who's now at West. Those folks really came together to ideate what would it look like to have a space dedicated to Black artistic production and have young people be sort of at the heart of that work and be an ongoing resource for them. And so they began to just write a proposal, and all legacy initiatives had to kind of go through the feasibility stage, particularly if they wanted to have capital involved. So there was a vision from the very beginning to create a space. Recognizing that, in our inner suburbs, a lot of our arts infrastructure is concentrated downtown, and as the suburbs, have grown and developed, and there were aspirations of having these complete neighborhoods that never really got realized. There's not a lot of space that people can go to just connect with one another, and for young people in particular, being able to access school programs and places where they can meet like-minded peers and creatives. So the vision was to create a space, create a Black Arts Center. And so they went through an initial feasibility study. They kind of began to pilot programs, and then they got awarded at the time $3 million to realize this dream of creating a Black Arts Center. And so, that was back in 2008. It took quite some time to find a space. One of the requirements was, which was pretty astute tip at the time from the fund, was to focus on a space that was publicly owned because of, again, the precarity of landlords and, us living in, upward real estate, which we now see the full brunt of that. And so this is a city-owned property. It took a long time to find a property that would be suitable for the center, and that was ideally located. So we found this space in 2014, and of course its proximity to Little Jamaica is really key in that this is a neighborhood where, Caribbean immigrants and African immigrants have been coming for decades to get their foodstuffs, to get their haircuts, to purchase records, to really build and connect a cultural community. So there's a long history of entrepreneurship and artistic production in this neighborhood, and so we felt really honored to be able to create roots, to put down roots in this neighborhood and extend that legacy that so many of our parents and our ancestors were part of creating here. And so got this whole vision in 2014, and then went through a very long process. I kept smiling and crying at the same time, of going through design and figuring out how do we utilize this building. So this building's been around since the 1900s. It is been a theater in its past life. It's been a cinema. It's been a bowling alley, and most recently it was a public health center. So I remember when I told my stepdad that I was working on a new project, and he's very spatially oriented, and just he's like Google Maps in his head. And so I was like, oh yeah, I'm working at 524 Oakwood, so you should just come in and see it. And he was like, 524. You work at a club? I see what you're doing. See where you're at. So it's also street club and another club. So lots of rich history. It's so fun when people come by and they're like, oh, I used to get my hair cut across the street, or we had a event producer come by and said he got sex ed in this building. He went to Longwood Academy. This was a health center. So just lots of nice connections that people have to the center just by virtue of being around in the community for a very long time. So we moved in 2014. We started doing some programming here, but it was also like a very old decrepit medical facility at that time, so it didn't really look like a space that you wanted to do black arts programming in. So we did work with a number of artists to do large-scale murals in the building at the time, and started to use it for residencies, and knowing that we were going to demolish it, kind of just give people full and free reign to work in the space and use it as best as we could. And then, went through this long design process, and so worked with a number of artists and got thinking through how could we make the facility as multi-use and multi-purpose as possible. And so that took a number of years of work, because we moved from being in one floor to what you now maybe see later is 3 floors. So went through a number of design iterations that were challenging, but we finally were able to break ground in October 2020. And so I think that was a pretty significant for me example of precarity, in part because we were going through this exercise of building a space, of ideating on how people could use it, how they would come together, what the rooms would do, and how that would be able to be supportive of artistic production at a time where we could not connect. So our, even construction announcement was fully distanced. We were on the sidewalk. We were, all had masks on, and so it was a really, jarring kind of questioning of whether this exercise really had value, thinking about not knowing what was on the other side of the announcement and construction, and, we're just going to spend all this time to, build this space, and then what is the future of, arts and people coming together. So it was definitely a need to kind of ignore, what was in some ways happening in parts of the world in order to, continue to push construction forward and work through all the challenges that we faced in terms of, finding, walls were decrepit, or, floors were uneven and hampering our accessibility plans. But I think that, as a society, as a community, we really had to grapple with how we're doing the work that we're doing, and who we're doing it for. I feel like every sector has just been, turned on its head in terms of thinking about what its purpose is and how it continues to operate in this, environment that we're still working through. So it really feels like, post that time, precarity has become kind of the norm, just in part because our world has changed so dramatically since the pandemic. And so we went through, 3 years of construction, and then opened up in November of 2023, so just late last year. And it was incredible to see people in this space, to see, folks who were involved in the very early days of the Nia Centre, come back and witness the moment of us bringing our community together and opening up this building. And I think that really, it really cemented a legacy of folks who've been dreaming about having this kind of space for a long time, that even predates, that kind of artist conceptualization in 2008, because, when we did our opening, we also did, an exhibition over at TIFF that kind of paid homage to other kinds of Black spaces that have, been paving the way for what is Nia Centre today, and I think we don't necessarily think about, 93.5 flow as a Black space, but, when I was young, I was listening to a Buffalo radio station in order to, listen to R&B and hip hop and music that I was interested in. Like, we take for granted now that you can click on the radio or you can have your Spotify membership and just access any kind of music that you want. But Toronto didn't have a, Black radio station until 1993. So there was a number of failed attempts to get that off the ground. So there's a lot of different, leadership and artists who tried to create different kinds of spaces, whether they were physical or on, the waves of, I don't know how radio works exactly, but what is there? Or, in their backyards, in their, front homes. We learned about folks who did, community organizing and political education in their living room, in their home, And so a lot of members of our community have had to deal with the precarity of not being seen as either legitimate artists, not being supported through, funding or access to space, not having that continuity in being able to continue to produce and make work because they haven't been adequately supported. And I think, really, what has resonated with me in terms of, talking to even folks who are eligible in the dance community, talking about coming to this country with their practice and, approaching different funders and not being recognized because they hadn't been to a formal institution, a ballet school, and being told that curtain folk dance is not real dance, and that's just 20, 30 years ago. And so really that kind of environment, that systemic racism is what has produced a lot of precarity for Black artists and Black artistic traditions, which is part of why this kind of space, I think, is important to both affirm artists in what they're doing, to affirm and say to a broader art sector and community that our traditions are valid, and not to mention valid are actually pushing culture in so many ways. And yet still, in fundraising for this project, people ask me, well, why are you building this? Why don't you just go and ask the AGO to include more, artists in their collection? Or why don't you, just assemble some artifacts and push for the ROM to include more artistic traditions? And it was in the sense that, these large institutions not recognizing that they have had this long history and opportunity to do this work and haven't. And we need to actually cultivate our own talent, right, to create a space that is affirming, because we know that these institutions are still grappling with valuing our work in the way that it should, embracing our artistic traditions, and elevating our artists. And so I think, there's always that tension between, do we carve out our own thing, or do we, figure out how to change the institution? But this work takes time, and I think that it's really vital for us to be able to ensure another generation of artistic creatives are not lost. Speaking to some of our elder artists, it's just like some of them gave up. They weren't supported, and so they stopped producing. And so that kind of, institutional barriers, I think, is something that has been an enduring feature of that Black artistic producers have had to push up against in forging ahead of this and sort of a future and kind of precarity that has had to be addressed. And so I think the lesson from our community is really about the kind of care, the kind of organizing that we've done as groups without institutional or formal support. I think Jordan and her Black Women's group, which is really, a WhatsApp group, but there's over 250 Black women artists in that group who come together, who do exhibitions, who have done major events, and who just offer care and support, information about residencies, information about, artistic opportunities. Folks are able to put in questions that they have about, contracts that they're reviewing. all kinds of resources and references, just leveraging, a simple technology that we all have on our phone. And I think those are some of we think oftentimes, obviously because we're a large sector in terms of addressing precarity, there are obviously macro initiatives that we need to be pushing for and advocacy that needs to be done, but there is a lot of, I think, care and, smaller scale initiatives that we can do to help, share resources and share understanding amongst us as actors in the sector. But I do want to acknowledge the challenging times that we're in, the volatility in our, just economic environment. Post-pandemic, of course, we're in the midst of the pandemic. We're, still grappling with audiences, feeling comfortable, feeling energized to come out to events. That's just been a significant shift that we've seen, for us as an organization and others across the sector. And, the future of that is not clear, right? Folks are continually competing with thing on their hands, as always being super entertaining. And now we have to talk about the value of connection, right? The value of not only the art, but the ability to see art live and in a room with other people and not just on a screen, right? So that's, I think, the level of precarity that we have, and we don't usually think about when we think of, precarious times, but it's a constant sort of underpinning, I think, of our work is how do we continually make sure that we're offering quality experiences and reminding people of the value of connecting, which we were desperate for in 2020, and now we're kind of flipping about. So that's the level of precarity. I think, as well, the threat of the threat opportunity of AI, as both a contributor in the creative space and, the ease that it provides for certain kinds of tasks, but also the threat that it provides to other creatives and artistic producers. Of course, the, shift to project-based funding and what I call the festivalization funding, that there's so much interest in sort of one-time big events that happen in the world as opposed to the work that happens day to day and localized in communities and offers support to people. There's a shift away from that and a shift, towards the big sponsor opportunity to have your, sponsor and branded lights over the course of the 2-day festival. And while festivals are great, bring people into the community, create opportunities for us to be great artists. They also can't replace the kind of day-to-day opportunities that we have to connect, to be creative, and to share community with others. So I think all of those factors are kind of, it's not, we don't have a clear end date. It kind of feels like we're in this just state of precarity, and so there's a real need to acknowledge it for one. I feel like at times we, talk about it, but it's not really part of a consideration of our actual organizing work. And so I really encourage us to think about what this means and leveraging both the technology for one, for example, to help us while being able to be critical of it. And I think those ongoing kinds of conversations are needed at a mass level in order for folks to not arrive at a place where they're like, oh wait, we're not creating with this anymore. We're not investing in creators. We're just using AI. So I think some of the other practices that I found to be promising is I think, yes, recognition of the issue and not just the symptom. I think too often we focus on precarity leads to scarcity, leads to competition, because we're not actually looking at the cause of the issue, and that to me is a conversation that constantly needs to be surfaced. When funders are like, oh well, your numbers went down on this event. It's like, well, let's talk about audiences and development, and as well as how the trends of people's participation in artistic events generally before we start analyzing, year-over-year data on one particular event. So keeping that top of mind. Of course, being able to diversify funding resources is important, but I think that's going to take a lot more innovation in this new time, as well as being able to be more collaborative. Partnerships take time, getting to know people, working together takes time, and people kind of, I think, folks sometimes take take that work for granted, but it might mean that, we need to spend more time getting to know each other so that we can, more quickly mobilize when we need to or work together. And having those strong networks of both organizations and creatives is going to be really key. I think we can't be just working in silos. It's a long, obviously, challenge for the sector, but I think now more than ever, there's that need to have a shared conversation and shared advocacy about the kinds of challenges that we're facing. And I think that the last one I would say is around, the flexibility and adaptability. We've always been a smaller kind of organization, which I think does help us to be both responsive and develop new initiatives that are responsive to community quite quickly. And I think that's what makes institutions quite challenged by the kind of environment that we're in, and also being significantly responsive because they are much slower to be able to mobilize, their larger organizations. And I think that ability to not be entrenched and be open to new ways of doing things is really key to us being able to respond to the kind of precarity and volatility that we're seeing around us. And then the last one is around advocacy and awareness, which we all know is important. But I think doing that from a much more shared perspective and being willing to go out and take more dramatic ways to advocate is really important. I think we're doing as a community and we do on the street front. That's just me. I think that the last point I would say is there's a lot of conversations I feel like I've been in the past few months around the value of art and talking about the value of art and the sector needing to do better at articulating what the value is of the art sector and what our contributions are as artists and producers and culture producers. And I agree. I think that there is, we feel it, audiences feel it, but the ability to actually convey that magic to other folks falls short. It does fall short quite a bit, but I do feel like we're not actually leveraging all of our skill sets as storytellers. I'd love to see a campaign, a group of artists or artist organizations tasked with building a campaign to talk about the importance of the arts and its values, taking, 9 months to ideate about what is specifically that magic and how do we translate that into a quick soundbite for people to be able to witness, experience, and persuade them. So I think that we need to put more awareness essentially into all of the work. We're so focused on the output, on the show, on the exhibition, on the work that we need to, I think, take a step back and actually get a line on talking through our story and create a compelling case together and tapping those, group of people that we want to do that and investing in the do so. I think we're just oftentimes so focused on the work. I think that's part of what a precarious environment drives, right? When you feel unsure, when you feel unstable, when you're not sure where that project funding is coming for, that capital funding is coming for, we produce. And I think part of the resistance and strengthening of our network is actually saying no and taking a step back and resting on our laurels a bit, because they're long laurels and they have lots of projects behind us, and actually taking the time to reflect and strategize and articulate our value proposition to everyone. So that feeds into my whole spiel about rest and the importance of that, but obviously can't give me time. So thank you so much for listening to my TED Talk. And if there are any questions, I'm happy to chat, but I have to see it in the